So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. Good afternoon or evening or even morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. So please keep your mics muted. And any technical issues that you may have, please drop us a note in the chat. And any questions for the Q&A session later on today, please plug those in the Q&A box below. We have a hashtag, so that's hashtag IOIT hack. So please go ahead and use that in social media as you're attending today's talk or the rest of the talk. So thank you for joining. I know we're having lovely weather here in London at least. So it's great to have you join us today. I'm Mariam. I'm leading the Internet of Ingestible Things hackathon series today. I'm a bit of background about myself. I'm a co-founder and director of Enteromics, which is a medtech startup that develops smart gut sensing pills. And alongside my role at Enteromics, I research biocrime and the Internet of Medical Things and biosecurity as part of my PhD studies, with an aim to inform evidence-based policymaking regarding biocrime. And so the Internet of Ingestible Things hackathon is part of this research. So Enteromics, the Dawes Center for Future Crime, the Biohacking Village, and the Institute of Healthcare Engineering have joined forces to deliver this hackathon or series of workshops that bring together experts from cyber security, from the medical device industry and makers to help design security for the Internet of Ingestible Things. Ingestible things are internet-connected ingestible medical devices such as smart gut sensing pills. So there's a link I'll just post now in the chat in case you'd like to register for the hackathon. And I'm posting now as well another link for more information. So the winning team has a chance to win a £1,000 cash prize sponsored by the Dawes Center for Future Crime. So the Dawes Center for Future Crime focuses on which emerging crimes we should focus given limited resources, and really answering the question on how we can mitigate future threats. But I won't get into that because our speaker will soon cover that for us. But as a prelude to the hackathon, we have a series of talks to really highlight the prospects and challenges of developing the ingestible things. I'll also post in the chat the schedule of our series of talks in the case you'd like to sign up and the ones coming up. And generally the structure of our talk today will be a 20-minute presentation from our speaker and followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box and start thinking about the takeaways for today, because I'd like to ask you in the end. So without further ado, first up, we have Professor Shane Johnson, who is the director of the Dawes Center for Future Crime at the University College London and co-director of the ESRC Center for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity. He has a PhD and an MA in psychology and a bachelor's in computer science. His work has been funded by UK research councils, charity trusts, the Home Office, to name a few, as well as the US Department of Defense. His research has a focus on topics including reducing crime through design, predictive policing, the application of complexity science, and really works towards building the evidence base of what works to reduce crime. So without further ado, Shane, please do share your screen, and over to you.
Thank you, Mariam. I'm going to attempt to share my screen now, so let's just see how this goes. That's working good. Okay, thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Mariam. So as Mariam said, I direct the Dawes Center for Future Crime, and it's that I'll talk about in the next 15 to 20 minutes or so. So the aim of the centre generally is to look at how emerging technologies or social or environmental changes might generate new crime opportunities, or how they might generate new approaches that we might use to reduce existing crimes or to stop sort of future crimes from emerging before that takes place. So I'll give you a kind of sense of what we're doing, hopefully, in this presentation. And to start, I wanted to put things into context by looking at crime and how it's sort of changed really quite generally over time. So the graph you're seeing here is data from the crime survey of England and Wales, and that's really acknowledged as providing probably the best picture of crime in at least the United Kingdom, and being better, for instance, than alternatives such as crimes reported to and recorded by the police. And the picture that you see here is one which we've seen throughout the world. So the blue line shows us what you might think of as sort of traditional urban crimes collectively. And what you can see is that through the 1980s, right up until the mid 1990s, we saw an increase in crime. And then since then, we've seen a steady decline in these kinds of offences. But of course, this kind of graph doesn't capture crimes which are committed online. Now, we've only very recently been able to capture that in the crime survey and England and Wales. And yeah, sorry, I'm just moving the Zoom thing so I can see the slides properly. When I add in data which captures crimes committed online, you'll see that we essentially sort of double the volume of offences that we're talking about. So the sort of take home from this, and I'll elaborate on this in a minute, is that in recent times we've seen an increase in this kind of offending, crimes committed online. And this is perhaps most sort of sharply comes into focus when we look at what's happened most recently. So disruption can cause changes in crime opportunities. It can accelerate change more generally. And we're very much seeing this with the global pandemic that we find ourselves at the moment. And this has very much changed patterns of mobility. We're finding ourselves traveling much less, but it also has led to us being online much more frequently than we were prior to the pandemic, engaging, for instance, in platforms such as this one. Now, what the graphs in front of you show are how traditional and online crimes have changed during this period. So those on the right-hand side relate to sort of these more traditional urban crimes. The orange lines there show you essentially the volume of crime observed across the period March through September, whereas the dotted line and the grey sort of shaded area show us what we would have expected those lines to look like had the trend that we saw prior to the pandemic continued. And you can see that for these two crime types, we're actually seeing much less crime than we otherwise would have expected. Now, if we look at online crime, and there's an example of this in the graph on the left-hand side, and these are data that come from Action Fraud. This shows us the count in online shopping fraud, both before and during the early stages of the pandemic. And hopefully what you can see very clearly from this is that kind of offending did increase quite significantly during that period. So the sort of take home from this is that the nature of crime can actually change quite sharply depending upon changes that we observe. And the kinds of things which affect the nature of crime can include both technological, environmental, or social changes. So what you see in front of you now is what futurists call the futures cone. And if you look to the left-hand side of the cone, what you'll see is kind of a kind of representation of the past. And the idea is that as time marches on, what the environment we find ourselves in is converges to a single point in time. And that's where we are now. This is what the environment looks like. But as we look from the present out to the future, what the cone is intended to show is that there's a lot of uncertainty. There are a lot of possible futures that might emerge, and of those, lots that are plausible, and of those that are more probable. And there'll also be those that are more preferable, the kinds of futures that we're hoping to observe and we would like to live in. So the point of sort of showing you this is partly because it's a tool used by futurists, but also just to say that you can see from this that things change over time, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future might be. Now, thinking about how things change, if we think historically, what's defined as a crime has changed quite significantly over time. Things that were crimes hundreds of years ago aren't crimes now, and so on. But also who deals with crime has changed over time, and how offenders adapt to the things that we do to try and reduce crime has changed. And we often see a kind of arms race evolving. Now, whilst there's a lot of uncertainty about how the future might look and so on, we know that as well as things changing, we know that certain patterns repeat. And one of those is that when new products and services are introduced into the market, it's often that case that little attention is given to the crime and security implications of those products and services by those who manufacture them or those who offer them. Now, unfortunately, we also know that offenders and attackers pay a lot of attention to those new products and services and identify vulnerabilities associated with them and crime opportunities that they might exploit. And consequently, what we see playing out often is offenders exploiting those opportunities, and we observe what is often referred to as a crime harvest. And I'm going to give you some examples of those crime harvests. And I thought I'd start with a really kind of old one. This is the first prepaid postage stamp, which was introduced into the United Kingdom in 1840. It's called the penny black. Once you'd used the stamp, what the post office would do is they'd frank it in a redding to indicate that it had been used, and this would cancel its further use. Problem was, at the time, redding was water soluble, which meant that you could wash it off with water. Blacking wasn't, which meant you could easily wash off the franking but then still reuse the stamp. That's exactly what happened. Now, I'm using this as an example because I think it's a really nice one to just illustrate just how people don't really think through the crime and security implications of products. So some thought had gone into this because franking was introduced, but the execution of the security measure was just really quite feeble. Because if we think this through, there are really actually only two permutations that they could have gone with. The one they went with created a crime opportunity because you could easily wash away the red franking, but had they tossed a coin and gone the other way, they would have produced a much more secure stamp in this situation. So that's a really historic example. But what about more recently? So another recent example would be vehicle crime and the security that is built into motor vehicles. So the figure that you see in front of you shows essentially two things. The shading is intended to illustrate ownership of vehicles, and this is limited to England and Wales, and you can see that increasing over time. The black line indicates the rate or car theft over time in the same country. And what hopefully you can see from this is that the rate of or the number of thefts increased steadily over time from the early 1970s right through until the middle of the 1990s. And if you owned a vehicle at that time, you won't be surprised. And because the reason for this is that at that time, in the sort of mid 70s, 80s and 90s, vehicles tended not to have electronic immobilizers. They didn't have alarms. In fact, for some brands of vehicles, the same key would open around 1 in 12 vehicles, which made it very easy to break into those particular vehicles. Now, the Home Office and various others had tried to encourage vehicle manufacturers to improve the security of these cars because the security was so woefully inadequate. But it was difficult to get them to do that. And you can see that in the data in front of you. Mid-1990s, the Home Office published what was called the Car Theft Index. All this did was to publish data on the rate at which particular makes and models of vehicles were stolen as a function of the number of those vehicles on the road. And the idea was to give consumers information which could guide their purchasing decisions. They could choose not to purchase those vehicles which were stolen with the highest frequency given their abundancy on the streets. And you can see that once they published the index, we saw vehicle crime reducing because essentially vehicle manufacturers, realizing the reputational damage, started to improve vehicle security. Now, lots of other things were happening at the time, so we can't necessarily credit the Home Office Car Theft Index with bringing about these changes, but it was the changes to security that certainly brought about the reductions in this kind of theft. Now, there are all sorts of other examples I can go through, but just to sort of make the point about the importance of design, we've seen recently a resurgence in levels of vehicle crime as a consequence of changes to the way in which vehicle security works. Okay, so I'll give you some other examples in a minute of more recent issues. But how do we generally avoid crime harvest is a question that we seek to answer. And it's for this reason that the Dawes Centre for Future Crime was established. And it was set up with a grant of £3.7 million from the Dawes Trust to do the things that I talked about at the start of this presentation. Now, doing this is obviously tricky because there are no future facts, as the slide says. So we need to engage in a range of methodologies to try and have foresight about what's coming and how we might address those issues going forwards. And that's exactly what we do. So just to give you a sense of the work we engage in, obviously I can't go through all of the projects, but just to give you a flavour of these, we fund sort of three sorts of activities. The first are scoping studies, which look at emerging technologies or social and environmental changes that might have crime implications. And what we do is to fund experts on those topics to review the state of the art of the evidence base and to then run a kind of sandpit activity with stakeholders. And you can see from the word cloud in front of you that we've engaged with a range of different stakeholders from academia, from the policy world, from policing, from the voluntary sector, and beyond. In fact, we've had over 300 different stakeholders participate in these sandpit events. And the idea of these events is to bring together these stakeholder groups to talk about the crime threats posed by a particular technology or social change, to better understand it through their insights and potentially data that may have available, and to also think through what the solutions to those issues might be, given the kind of constraints under which those stakeholders are acting or that others might be acting. So the idea of those workshops is essentially to better understand the problem and to think about what we might do next. The scoping studies that I've just talked about are typically quite short in duration, maybe 3 to 6 months. So we also do slightly longer projects, often funded by external agencies, and I'll talk through some examples of those in a moment. But the scoping studies also inform our PhD programme, and we have funding for up to around about 22 PhD students. And current students are working on topics including Brexit and crime, the ways in which new payment methods might facilitate money laundering. We're looking at smart cities technology, the ways in which it might reduce crime, or the ways in which vulnerabilities associated with that might allow offending. We're looking at artificial intelligence and the way in which that might enable crime as well as help reduce it. We're looking at biotechnologies, which obviously Mariam is working on. We're looking at cryptocurrencies and the ways in which that might facilitate various forms of crime. And we're looking at topics such as tech-facilitated domestic abuse and ways of reducing it, and child sexual exploitation online and approaches to reducing that kind of a problem. So I thought I'd just briefly talk about one of these kind of longer term projects. And the one I thought I'd start with is the consumer Internet of Things, because it's closely related to what we're talking about today. Consumer Internet of Things refers to everyday electronic devices that are now internet connected. So these range from smart televisions, smart fridges, through to security cameras, thermostats, and so on. And the reason for connecting these devices to the internet is at least twofold. One is it means that they can connect to each other, which means one device can trigger actions from another, which can improve your kind of experience of those devices or the way we interact with our environment. But also connecting these devices to the internet and the cloud means they've got access to massive volumes of data and massive volumes of processing power that these devices otherwise couldn't have access to. And there's increasing ownership of these devices in the UK and worldwide. But the problem with these devices, of course, is that when they were first introduced, and to a large extent today, manufacturers have kind of been in a race to get their products to the market so they can establish a foothold. They've done this absent any regulation around the security of these devices. And they're doing this in the context of wanting to keep the cost of these devices low. So many of these devices have vulnerabilities, including things like default usernames and passwords, passwords including things like admin or 4 zeros. Those passwords can be obtained on the open web or from the dark web. These devices are often low powered and have inadequate specifications to allow you to update them in the future. So if software vulnerabilities are identified, it's very difficult to improve that. With many devices, data isn't encrypted when it's stored on the device or when it's sent to or from those devices. And this obviously creates lots of vulnerabilities and attack vectors. I guess most famously, these devices have been used for crime in the context of distributed denial of service attacks. So these occur when a computer or a series of devices send massive volumes of requests to a website or an internet server, so many so that the server is no longer able to cope, and we basically force it offline. And one of the most famous attacks took place in 2016, and this was the Mariam malware, which took control of lots of essentially security cameras around the world to form a botnet to launch one of these distributed denial of service attacks. In the first instance, it took the DIN servers offline in the United States, meaning that services such as Netflix and Twitter were unable to operate for a period of about a day. Now, you might be sort of asking yourself, why do we care about these kinds of attacks? It's knocking commercial services offline. It's not really a big deal, and maybe those services could better protect themselves. Well, of course, denial of services attacks could be launched at other services, the home or essential services that we all want to access. But vulnerable devices such as these can also generate other opportunities for crime, with which some of you may have seen news articles about some of these. Examples of which are on the slide in front of you. So as part of this work, one of the things that we did was to review systematically the academic literature on crimes that could be facilitated by the Internet of Things and how those crimes might be conducted, but also to look at the open media literature on this so that we capture those things which haven't yet been reported in the academic literature. And the sorts of offences that we identified included the denial of service attacks I've talked about, but also researchers identified the possibility of burglary being committed with these devices. After all, locks, window locks, door locks and so on are increasingly internet connected. We also saw crimes such as domestic abuse being highlighted. Kind of scenario that we've seen actually play out in the real world here would be where an offender gains access to, or has always had access to, an internet connected device in a victim's household. And often what they would do to exploit this would be to switch those devices on in the middle of the night, for instance, so they could effectively gaslight the victim. We saw examples of stalking taking place in the real world and also discussed in the academic literature. And the way that this would play out, for instance, is that many of these devices have geolocation information stored in them, which means you can track where people are, or you can tell when somebody's home or when they're leaving the home. Okay. So, as well as looking at the kind of harms that are created, and from our review identifying that there are warning signs of a crime harvest, we asked the question, if you were a consumer, is it possible to buy a more secure device? And the answer to that question is yes. Some devices on the market are much more secure than are others. But how can you tell which device is more secure? So we asked that question. We looked at a set of devices to see whether we could determine which were more secure than others prior to their purchase. And specifically, we looked at 270 devices which could be purchased in the United Kingdom. And we looked at what information we could get about those devices prior to purchasing them. And we found that for 100 of those, we could find out absolutely nothing. For the remainder, we were able to find online user manuals or other information which would allow us to assess things about those devices. But typically what we found was that there's very little information conveyed about the security of those devices. So for example, absolutely none of them reported for how long security updates will be provided for the firmware associated with the device. Very few provided information on how you keep that device secure, and very few talked about levels of encryption and so on. So this creates a market asymmetry whereby consumers don't have the information required to know which devices are more secure than are others. And we work very closely with the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport to inform their Secure by Design agenda. So their aim at the moment is to secure the Internet of Things through various means. And I can talk about that perhaps later if there is interest in doing that. But what I wanted to do just before closing was to just very briefly talk about one of the other projects that we have ongoing. And this concerns artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence refers to systems that are able to correctly interpret external data, learn from it, and use that learning to complete specific tasks. And these are typically goal specific, such as being able to differentiate between particular stimuli. So with machine vision, this might be differentiating between cats and dogs, or engaging in natural language processing. So when you speak to a Siri or an Amazon Echo device, it's essentially translating what you say into written text so that actions can be performed. Or we've got examples like the robotics that I just showed you in the video. So these are very goal-specific tasks, and the idea of a generalized AI that can do lots of different things is much more aspirational at this point in time. Now, AI has been, we've seen an explosion in AI, partly because of advances in computer science, but also because of the massive volumes of data that are now available on the internet. I thought I'd just ask a quick question just before coming to a close. Which of these faces are real? And I'll give you a second just to consider that. Well, the answer to this is neither of them are real. They were both generated by a machine learning algorithm called a generative adversarial network. And essentially, the way that these work is that you have one machine learning algorithm which is very good at a classification test. So, for instance, determining whether something is real or fake. And what the second algorithm does is it learns from massive volumes of data to be able to to be able to learn what a particular thing looks like, in this case, faces. Having done that, it's able to then generate these kinds of images from scratch. And the examples you see in front of you are from the StarGAN2 algorithm, which can generate new faces at a rate of around about 1 per second. Now, I'm not going to talk about the crime implications of this kind of technology, but I would invite you to think about what those might be. And we may come back to that if there are questions. So in closing, what I wanted to say is hopefully I've convinced you that innovation crime sequences are somewhat ubiquitous, and we really need to look out for these and try and guard against them in the future. With the work that we've been doing, we've very much been working with multiple stakeholder groups, such as those listed, because addressing these issues requires their input, both in understanding the problems, but also delivering effective solutions to them. So the ways in which we've been doing that are through the sorts of stakeholder workshops that I've talked about, through publishing policy briefs. So we've got policy briefs on our website, which are sort of short, digestible summaries of the kind of much longer research papers we publish in journals. And I would invite you to take a look at those if you're interested in them. And then finally, we've been, this year in particular, running seminar series with the Home Office for government departments, but also the voluntary sector, to feed in information on some of these threats so they can be considered a very early process in the policy making process.
Shane, thank you. That was extremely interesting. So I think inviting speakers today with kind of the quote on "Have you seen Minority Report" is not far-fetched. So I'm opening it up now to questions, and I'll start up the Q&A session with one. I was really interested, Shane, you spoke about the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and I'd like to hear a bit more about how you, what are the particular things you looked at when you were looking to inform the IoT or Internet of Things work, and how you conducted the test with the consumers to really inform them on the security risks.
Sure, brilliant. Thanks. Good question, Mariam. So, I mean, when we were doing this project, obviously there's a range of different policy options open to like a government department and industry for that matter. And so the first things that we did was to have meetings with the various stakeholders to discuss possible solutions and issues going forwards. And from those, a range of questions emerged. And also a range of assumptions emerged. So lots of the folks that were involved in the sort of technical side of the IoT seemed to assume that consumers would be able to know all of the sorts of things that they knew about these devices. So that was one of the things, we were going to do this work anyway, but it really reinforced the need to actually look at what consumers can find out prior to purchase. So that was one of the things we looked at. Another issue that came up, both from DCMS but also from these stakeholder workshops, particularly from industry and security experts, were a couple of things. One was that consumers wouldn't be willing to pay for security. So the assumption was that consumers just wanted the cheapest product and so on. So we did a series of studies using sort of econometric techniques where we would sort of run simulated purchasing choice scenarios and see whether consumers would be willing to pay for security and exactly how much they'd be willing to pay. And you can do this in various ways, and there are some more sophisticated methods than others where you can estimate what people would be willing to pay without it being obvious that that's what they're answering. And we found actually, people were willing to pay quite a lot more for security, but it depends on what the device is. So for some devices, they're willing to pay quite a lot more, whereas for others, it would be a small amount. So for televisions, for instance, they weren't willing to pay that much more for security. But for other sorts of devices that be more intrusive, they were. The other thing which came from those sorts of experimental pieces of work was that we found that consumers typically assumed that these devices were already secure. So it wasn't a question of whether you should pay more for security. There are lots of assumptions that these devices would automatically be secure by design, which we know isn't the case. So that was part of the work that we undertook, was to establish that. One of the other policy options we explored was a security label. So, when you buy like a tub of margarine, or you buy, a fridge with the margarine, it'll tell you how healthy it is, and there's a rating system to tell you about that. If you buy a fridge, it'll tell you about the energy efficiency associated with it. And in fact, with fridges, these labeling schemes have been so successful that they keep having to change them to differentiate between like an A triple star product now versus an A double star product, because they've really informed the consumer market, and people have voted with their feet, as it were, or with their wallets. So we explored whether a security label would inform consumer choice, again in simulated environments. And the idea was to look at what types of label, whether different types of label would have different effects on purchasing choice, and they do. So there are better or worse ways of conveying this sort of information. I think I'll stop there, Mariam, because I'll end up talking for
Great. Thank you, Shane. So we have a follow-up question here. So in terms of regulation, should we require every innovation company to have a security team to ensure that the new product is somewhat crime-proof?
That's a great suggestion. Yes, I think we you ought to at least have somebody thinking about this stuff, right? Because I think this is the fundamental problem, is that this kind of thinking isn't done, and that's why often we end up with products and services as well. Because I wouldn't want to push all this onto products. It's the sort of services that are provided through applications on your phone and various other things can also generate these sorts of threats, and that there really ought to be some mechanism through which people go to just check that what they're doing isn't likely to generate the sort of crime risks that we're talking about here. Yeah.
Excellent. And Shane, I know you gave us an example with the AI kind of crime threat. Now, I'm thinking of the kind of ingestible things hackathon and what participants should really be thinking about, because they will be developing essentially an IoT device, right? That would be paired up to some sort of app, or that has AI analytics as well there. I mean, what would you advise participants kind of to start thinking about when at ideation stage? What's the security by design features they should be thinking about and implementing within the hackathon?
Wow. Okay. If I could answer that fully right now, we wouldn't need a hackathon, right? Because so I think what we should be thinking about is an adversarial approach. So given what you're designing and what you're able to do yourself, how would you exploit that? And that's, I guess, the first stage in all of these sorts of approaches, and having a kind of red-blue team kind of system where you have somebody that's the defender and somebody that's the attacker, and thinking through the stages in an arms race of like what you would do and what the counter move might be, and then the subsequent counter move has to be, and so on. But I think so that would be the general approach I would think would be sensible. But you'd also want to think about the sort of different dimensions of this, wouldn't you? So what is it that's going to be vulnerable, and what are the ways in which its vulnerability might be exposed? So is it data, or is it control of the device, or is it something else? And I think you'd have to start by mapping that sort of that landscape out, if you like, and thinking that through, and then thinking through some sort of wildcard scenarios that seem kind of crazy, but actually, if happened, could be catastrophic. So I think I wouldn't omit the kind of the more unusual sort of attack surface things that are possible.
Absolutely, especially in the integrations, I would suspect that there needs to kind of be a focus there as well. And were there any other examples that you could give us in terms of crime threats regarding AI that you came across through your research?
Yeah, so there was a few. So on the AI-enabled crime, what we did, or the researchers did as part of that project, is to look at threats which have been discussed in the various literatures, but then also with the stakeholder group, add to that things that they perceive were crime threats, and to then rank order those. We didn't quite rank order them, but they used that sort of approach to see which would be the priorities. So which are the biggest threats, and some of the issues that came up, are fairly obvious ones, I suppose. Things like driverless vehicles being used as sort of terrorist weapons. But the other sorts of developments, very much related to the generative adversarial networks I talked about before, related to the fact that those systems can now be used not just to generate images of people, but you can use them to generate text which looks very much like it was written by a human. And so one of the exploits there, or exploit scenarios there, would be that you could essentially generate phishing emails that look much more realistic than the ones we typically receive however many times a day. But you could also tailor them to an individual. So by looking at automatically scraping information from social media posts, you could tailor that phishing email to look much more convincing and to tap into the sorts of interests of that individual. So that's one that worries me, because you could do that at scale and you could have it much more, a much more convincing kind of approach. With the images that we just saw, there are, possibilities for things like dating scams and stuff like that. Anything where you need to use an image, where you don't want people to be able to spot the fact you're reusing images, you want to create new ones that can't be detected. So yeah, quite a few threats associated with those. And if people are interested, we have a briefing note on the AI-enabled threats, and there is a paper published online in the journal Crime Science, which goes through the methodology, what was done, and what the outcomes of that were too.
Excellent. I'll definitely post the link here at the chat. And actually, that's a great segue to mention that one of the outcomes from the hackathon hopefully will be to create a policy briefing in terms of the Internet-Ingestible-Things. All right, thank you. I think we've had loads of takeaways today. Certainly mine was that the nature of crime can change quite sharply due to various factors, so technological, environmental, social changes, and that these create possible, probable, or preferable future scenarios. I like that, the alliteration there. And if not taken into account, new products that come into the market can create what we call crime harvests, where security is overlooked as new products enter the market. And we had a few really good examples, including consumer IoT devices that have introduced new attack vectors. So whether that be from home appliances, which have increased things like burglary, domestic violence, but most worryingly, I suspect, are the ones that have certain implications as well to our health. We were scared a little bit with examples of crime threats through artificial intelligence. And I think it's important to say, actually, Shane, the one in terms of the text kind of crime threat, it does become worrying, because even with COVID, we had certain bodies, even the WHO, World Health Organization, getting targeted by phishing emails as well. Universities getting targeted for vaccine development, etc. So please, everyone, do type in the chat with your takeaways today. This recording will be shared on our website, so you can pop back in and rewatch it. Please tune in to our next talk, which explores the consumer health and wellness side. So today, we spoke about IoT devices. This Thursday, we will specifically look at the gut microbiome and how certain devices applied there have both prospects and challenges. Once again, thank you for joining. Please do sign up in the next ones and register for our Internet of Ingestible Things hackathon. It'll be great. We're cross-pollinating the teams. We're having individuals from both with techie backgrounds, regulatory backgrounds, as well as patients as well to design a new era of ingestible things. Thanks again, and see you on Thursday.